This is the Parents in Sport podcast. Amazing guests, honest conversations, topics that matter.
Welcome to season 5 of the Parents in Sport podcast. I am your host, Gordon McClelland, and I'm delighted to be joined today by athlete development consultant at the Australian Institute of Sport and author Graham Turner. Graham, thank you for joining us on the show.
Hi, Gordon. Thanks for having me. I've really been looking forward to doing this, actually, because I know that you're doing some great work, and so it's great to be able to connect and see if I can contribute.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. And such a key topic that we're going to be talking about today. You know, there's lots in the world and in the media around the athlete's voice and the athlete's perspective and what that means for adults, I guess, involved in the sporting experience. Just before we get into that, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background and your story?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I started off in sport actually quite a while ago now, back working for Wolverhampton Wanderers. So that was before the days of the Premier League and academies. That was the old centre of excellence. And I was a coach, a technical coach, dealing with the young schoolboys. So that could be from 8, 9 years old all the way up. And in those days, there weren't such a big array of specialists. So I actually had a dual role. I was also the under-18s team physio. So I did that for a few years, and an opportunity came up for me to go in the physiotherapy way. So I then became a first team physio with Crewe Alexandra. And I guess you'll get, this is the nature of me. I've been on a learning journey, which has taken me in different directions. So started off technical, went into medical. Actually, when the institutes were brought into the UK and they were looking for quality assurance for strength and conditioning practitioners, I was a founder member of the UK Strength and Conditioning Association on the board. And so then went into the field of strength and conditioning, and that allowed me to really branch out into lots of different sports. So Commonwealth Games sports, Olympic sports. Moved up north and I was at Leeds Beckett University. So I was a senior lecturer in sports coaching. Introduced to the great game of rugby league there. So again, different experiences. And then eventually took a gamble and decided to go for a change of lifestyle, moved out to Australia. And as we know, working in high level elite sport, it's difficult to get in. So I took a job in the Northern Territory Institute of Sport, right up in the tropics. So that was a fantastic experience out with the regional, remote Indigenous communities and their athletes. On the back of that, I got a job as the National Elite Coaching Manager for Gymnastics Australia. So there I was working with the 4 different sports, men's, women's, rhythmic and trampoline, helping them. That was around the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games time. And on the back of that, for the last 4 years now, I've been at the Australian Institute of Sport. And my role is specifically looking at what we call future cycle. So, of course, we've got Paris coming up. My job is to work with sports to help them with their strategy, look at the way that they're developing their athletes for specifically the LA Games and, of course, Brisbane 2032, which that being a home games for Australia, real big emphasis on that for us to do as well as we can.
Yeah, amazing stuff. I mean, you've certainly got a busy time in Australia over the next few years, and certainly with the football that's just been there, you've got some pretty cool events coming up. Nice to hear. Also, there a couple of the partners that we work with. You know, one of my favourite days is going to Wolverhampton Wanderers every year, and it's great to work with Gymnastics Australia. I mean, we're here to talk today. I mean, I'm really interested in the S&C work and also the work that you did up in the Northern Territories to see if that was any different to maybe in the mainstream cities. But we're here to talk about, you know, the young athlete's perspective, and you've written a fantastic book on it, which I did find really enlightening. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in the youth development space with a young athlete. Back in the day when I was an undergrad, it was the days, as I say, before the elite Premier League academies. It was when Liddershall had a national school, and they used to take people like Michael Owen for a couple of years, and they'd go and work there. And that's where I first did my first look at the young athlete for my undergrad. being able to work in that space went on. I qualified as a PE teacher first, and of course got my coaching badge, and then did a master's in sport and exercise science. And I guess I thought I knew quite a bit about it. But of course, when you get your own children, you start to see a totally different side to things. So this is where it obviously connects with your work. And so I've learned a hell of a lot from my children. And so with the book, the main inspiration for this was my son Elliot. He's a typical young lad growing up, football mad. And he wasn't bad, he did have scouts looking at him, and he got signed. We were living up in Leeds, and we stayed local. He had a great experience. He signed for Bradford City as an under 9. Anyways, going through the years, and he got to about 12, 13, and his coaches said to him, "Yeah, you're doing okay, but big year next year. You're going to need to make sure you keep fit in the summer." So by this stage, I'd worked with a lot of different teams, sports, athletes, and I thought, this is perfect for you, son. I'm the expert. I can give you exactly what you need. So I'll take you out and show you how to get fit. So I introduced my son to interval training. And very early on in the interval training, he said, "I'm not doing another one." I was like, typical parent, "Come on, son, just focus, get your breathing right. You'll be able to do it." Anyway, he did it, and then he got up. When he got his breath back, he got up and he said, "I'm never doing that again." He's a 13-year-old. He gets his fun out of running around, kicking a ball, being with his mates. So anyway, we get back in the car, and I'm sure that you spend a lot of time talking about this, the car journey. So this time it was the opposite way around, because I had a chat with my son, giving him my best advice, but then he gave me his best advice. And what he said to me, and this is what sticks with me, is, "Dad, you just don't understand the mentality of a 13-year-old." And I guess I had a choice then, didn't I? I had a choice. I could either say to him, "No, you need to think about it like this," or I could actually invite myself to say, well, what does that actually mean? What does it look like? So I stood back from that. I didn't speak to him. And I was at the stage where I had the opportunity to take my academic studies further. And I decided, you know what? I'm actually going to look at this. I'm going to look at it through a PhD study. So I didn't do a PhD on my son. He's probably very thankful for that. I decided I wanted to look at the experience of young people. And in fact, that word mentality is an interesting word, because you'll often see it in interviews. In high performance sport, lots of different coaches and managers, they talk about the mentality of the athlete, the mentality of the player, whether it's a girl or a boy. In actual fact, mentality isn't something that's measured psychologically. All that it means is the way that someone interprets and responds. So I was looking to find out, okay, so we've got our perspective on this experience and how it should look, what should be done, but actually, what's that like for the young person? And I had a few sports who were really keen for me to look at it in their sport, but I actually said, no, this isn't actually for the sport, and this isn't about the sport. This is for the young person, because I started with a belief that if we can actually get on the same page with a young person, and we can understand how they feel, what they think would work for them, how it would be different if they got to have some input into it, then wouldn't that benefit us all? So I actually didn't go with any specific sport. I got a group of young people, boys and girls, different sports, and met them. Of course, as soon as they met me, they didn't really know me. It took them a bit of time to get to know me. But what I had to be really clear to them was, look, I'm not doing a study about talent development. I'm doing a study about the experience of the young person in the talent development program. So actually, I'm not going to make any judgments about why you're here, how did you get here, how good are you, what's your potential, where will you end up? And I'm actually not going to even worry about that. We're just going to see, what is it like right now for you in this experience? What are the challenges? What are the disappointments? What really motivates you? Who's helping? Who's getting in the way? So, we talk about a PhD, don't we? And we may think, well, there's obviously a sophisticated methodology going on. Well, I had the idea for a sophisticated methodology, but the kids kind of told me that wasn't very good. So I went back to the drawing board and said to him, so you tell me what's the best way for me to learn about this? And I got some really simple advice. Why don't you just come and see what we do and ask us about it? And so that's the way it went. And I kind of entered, I was really fortunate in terms of we were in the middle of emigrating. So my family moved over to Australia, but left me behind. We thought that'd be a really good plan to help me with data collection. And so I entered the world of the young person, which of course is, I send an email for them to arrange to meet me. They don't do emails. So I turn up, they won't be there. Ironically, ethical approval said you're not allowed to communicate with under 18s on their phones. But if they did open the email, guess what? They opened it on the phone anyway. So I must admit, they started to contact me on the phone, because what happened is, I would have a meeting with them, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, I've got a trial tonight." We were in one part of the country, might be an hour and a half drive away, and they'd say, "Oh, do you want to come?" Just the young persons, they're thinking like, "This is what happens. This is what we're gonna do." And what I started to do was respond to these just really quick, dynamic kind of world that they live in. So it'd be like, "Yeah, I'll come." Get in the car, off we go. Another time, I might have a text on a Sunday morning. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. I've got a game this morning. It's 2 hours away, but you can come if you want." I'd be there. I'd say, I'll get in the car and I'll come. So what I used to do was go along, take a bit of video, take some notes, go to different competitions. And then we come back and we'd just have a chat. And I'd be like, "Well, what was going on there?" And I wasn't trying to add any expertise to the conversation. I wasn't trying to tell them what they should have done or what they shouldn't have done or give them feedback on what was good. I was just saying, I just want to know what was going on there. What was that like? How are things at the moment? So anyway, I did the PhD. And here's the problem then, because the purpose was I wanted to do something that I felt could have a real impact to help the experience of young people in these programs. So, of course, the main people who are really influential and support and important are the coaches and the parents. Now, I do a lot of work with coaches. Obviously, I'm a parent myself, spend a lot of time with parents. Not many of those people are going to be reading a PhD. So then you come down to, well, what do most people do? Well, they come up with a research article. And for a research article, what you have to do is reduce the information. And my actual results in my PhD, it was a bit of an innovative approach. My results were the stories. So they were the words of the young people. And I decided that I didn't want to reduce the story. I didn't want to take away from the words of the young people. I didn't want to put it into my own words. And so I left it for a little while, but it gnawed away at me. And I thought, you know what? The best way for me to do this is to self-publish. So I looked into that, into how to do it. That was interesting again. Looked how to do it on Amazon. And that's what I came up with. I actually, after going through all the academic process, I then hired an editor. And I said to the editor, I want you to work with me to make sure that this book is not academic, because I wanted it to be user-friendly. And the other thing that I would say is the advice that I got about a book is be really clear on your target audience. And I have to say that was a challenge for me. And that's because I honestly believe that there's great benefit for coaches and for parents in listening to the stories and the wisdom of these young people. But what I also know is, because I work with a lot of high performance coaches, if some of them thought that actually this was a book that was targeted for parents, they'd think that it wasn't for them. So there's a deliberate effort from me in terms of, when you look at the information around the book, I actually asked the question, are you supporting or are you helping develop a young athlete? If you are, this is the book for you. So yeah, that's what led to the book. And it's been out there now 3 or 4 months. And I've been really pleased with the feedback.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the read, and obviously it's certainly in my wheelhouse, because a bit like you, I'm right in the middle of all of this, and it's really interesting listening to, working with young people today. I think the reality for both of us, and I've certainly found this, is the approach that I took with my children in their younger years was severely outdated. It may have worked for me in the 90s and early 2000s as a coach, but actually I was going to have to change. I was going to have to refine what I did. I'm always very open actually about the car journey home, because after having the expectations on a 6-year-old son that I probably had with elite under 18 players in those early years, my daughter followed behind. And I said to her one day when she was 10, I said, right, Pippa, Dad's taking you to sport today. I'm really excited. And she said, well, I'm really excited too, Dad. She said, but there's going to be no car bossing. And she said, I know that you know something about sport, so I'm happy for a few tips, but you're going to do it nicely. And it was the best thing that ever happened, because at that point, a bit like you had with your son when you're trying to churn out your interval running, which quite honestly, none of us like to do, even when we were in decent sport either. So why a 13-year-old would like it? Was that I still managed to probably get across some of the things I wanted to get across. I've just had to do it very differently. I've had to fit it into the context of her world, do it at the appropriate time, with, in her case, with nobody else around. If it's me and her, it's fine. In front of other people, she doesn't like it. And I think the challenge for all of us, organizations, coaches, and parents, is how we make sense of this generation of young people, which are different. They're living in a different age through no fault of their own. There's lots of things that, in parents' talks crop up all the time about this generation, how we work with them. But also, I think the challenge for a lot of coaches and a lot of parents is, that's fine, but when do we jump in and overrule with, we know better because we've been there and done it? Because experience, as you know, is obviously a good thing as well. That's the whole point of being a parent, is you hopefully have some ideas. So I think all of that, the stuff that you found is really incredible from a stories point of view. And I love the fact that the kids just said, oh, just come along, see what we do and ask some questions, because that's ultimately when they're happiest, aren't they? Anything formal, they find more challenging. So from the stories, and you obviously did a range of sports, which you can tell us all about, what were the biggest takeaways for you from hearing from the young people?
The biggest takeaway is, well, there's if I talk about the essence of their experience, there's two things. Like, one is hard work, and make no mistake about it, once they start to get into that pathway, talent development environment, obviously the demands increase, the expectations increase, and the young person buys into that they have the dream and they say, right, okay, I know this is going to be difficult, but all right, I'm going to have a go at it. And so they commit to hard work. And I think one of the things that came out was they didn't feel as though that it was always recognized how hard they were working, because that's not just within the environment when they're training. It's not just within games, but it's also, it comes to influence every area of their life. People are making decisions about how they spend their time, what they do with their education, and trying to balance that against their sport. So the fact that they were committed and it was really hard work. And then the ultimate, this is the interesting thing, I find anyway, that there's absolutely no rocket science here whatsoever. These are really obvious things that are just reinforced to us. And so the experience of young people ultimately is determined by the way that they're treated by the adults who run the program. And again, in terms of that ambition, long-term aspiration, what we know is, even if you succeed at the highest level, there's one thing that's guaranteed for every athlete, and that's it. At some stage, you're going to exit the program. So whether it's going to be as an 8-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 25-year-old who's injured, or a 31-year-old who's had a great career and wants to finish at the top. And so the experiences along the way, the memories that are made, let's face it, as we know, not only is it the minuscule percentage that actually make it to be an elite performer, but it's even less of them who go on to win things. So there's so much investment, so much hard work goes into this. You've got to feel as though it's been worth it, and you've had a good time. And in terms of, there's a lot of talk about the word sacrifice now, and a lot of athletes saying no, it shouldn't be. You shouldn't have to make sacrifices. It should be about choice. It shouldn't be that you've got to necessarily give up things that you'd like to be able to do. So those were the main two things: the hard work and the nature of the experience.
Yeah, I think the hard work one is really one to bring out. And I say this a lot to parents that, this younger generation today, we talk about them about hard work and patience. The reality is, to develop in sport, you need both. Yeah, actually, in their lives at the moment, society's telling them, oh, no, you can have everything instantly. If I want to buy something, I can hit go on Amazon. If I want to order a takeaway, I can hit Uber Eats. And I love the one that Simon Sinek came out with. I don't even now need to build really deep relationships and learn how to do really bad chat up lines, because I can just swipe right or swipe left on a dating app. And he's absolutely right. So we're trying to, obviously, we understand commitment, hard work and things, but actually that messaging for young people can sometimes be a difficult thing to sell for parents and coaches. The nice thing to hear is in the people that you found is that they realized that if they were going to have a go at it, that they understood that if they were going to have a go at it, it had to look like that. And I had Rachel Vickery, the New Zealand international gymnast, on the podcast recently, and she said this, that yes, they've got a choice. Yes, they've got a voice. But actually, there's a consequence to that voice as well, because that's what we're there to say. So you can decide to do it. But what you can't have is, I want to be this, or I want to achieve this. And then there may be the behaviors or the things next to it aren't aligned. And that's probably our role, isn't it? Well, how do we have those discussions with them to say, well, yeah, that's fine if that's what you want to do, but it might have an impact here, or it might have an impact here. And we think that it's still ultimately their choice, of course, but it's a very hard thing for the adults to manage around it. I include parents and coaches in that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that takes me on really to the first story in the book, which is called Split Decision. And that is about a young man who, at the age of 16, arguably was one of the best athletes in the country. And how do I make that assumption? Well, we talk about sampling, and this was a young person who'd been encouraged to do more than one sport. And by the age of 16, he was still at a really high level in two sports. And I remember when I first sat down with him and he said, yeah, people always say, which one are you going to choose? And he said, I don't know. I'm just enjoying myself doing both. So I think something will probably happen that'll make that choice for me. So he was, when I say one of the best athletes in the country, he was a rugby player. And at 16, he was chosen for the England under-16 rugby side. And he was also a discus thrower and one of the best discus throwers in the country. And up until that age of 16, what he'd been doing was he'd been playing rugby during the winter. And as soon as the rugby season was finished, then he'd get into his discus and he'd start throwing his discus. But of course, what I would find is it was really difficult at the end of the rugby season to get back into discus, with it being such a technical sport. It's all being strong and powerful, but it's really technical. So he would find that he'd lose his technique. By the time his technique was coming back, he's just getting back to the end of the season, and actually it's time to stop again and go with rugby. So he'd been supported by his parents, which is fantastic, I think, to continue with both. And he got to the under-16 year, and he knew that if he went to the UK schools and if he won the discus, he'd be able to represent GB. So his aspiration at that age was to get the GB vest. So he made the decision, which was tough, because he's at school and working hard as well. I'm going to continue training for discus all the way through the winter while I'm still doing rugby. Straight away, of course, we're getting into load management and the dangers of doing too much. And ironically, as you'll know all too well, that's the big danger for the good athlete, because quite often, even if they've got one specialist sport or even two, then they've got the school saying, oh yeah, but you're really good at this, come and play this for us. You've got your extra training sessions because you're doing well, you get selected, whether it's for county and then if it's above. So you've got all these demands going on. And of course, perhaps we might say it was inevitable. Once he was starting to ramp up the discus and actually came back into pre-season training for rugby, then he ends up getting a bit of a groin strain. Of course, he needs to stop the rugby for a while, and the physio is telling him, well, look, you need to have a break. You need to have a couple of weeks off. And it was close, and it was coinciding with when George would need to go and compete at the discus. So anyway, George was really focused and said, well, I'm going to need to come back a bit earlier than that because I've got this discus event. And it's one of the quotes in the book. The physio said to him, well, you'll have to face the consequences of that decision. And so George, off he went to the discus, and he was okay. He'd done the rehab, so it wasn't that he was injured. Competed in discus, won the discus, so he qualified to represent GB. And again, in his words, he was absolutely buzzing. So he's really pumped. He comes back. He goes into training for the first time again at the rugby club. And the head of the program called him in, sat him down, and in his words, gave him a bollocking. And it's I find it's a really strong section of the book to listen to how George felt about that. And again, we come back to the point of guidance and choices. He was getting the messages from the head of the rugby club. You know, you've got a lot of work to do. You haven't made it. You can't. George was picking up that he was pretty average. He was getting the message that he was average and thinking, well, if I'm pretty average, I've just got paid for England now. So how does that work? But he was given a really hard time on, you shouldn't have gone and done that. Are you serious? Because we're serious about investing in rugby players. If you're not going to be serious, then what's going to happen? And there could have been a totally different approach taken to that. There could have been a supportive conversation where some guidance was given. But the result of that conversation was George went home, spent a couple of days thinking about it with his parents, went back in and said, okay, fair enough, I've decided I'm not going to play rugby anymore. So there's someone with really good prospects. I'm sure that the sport of rugby would have been really keen to keep him in the sport. But that's just an example of how, when you come to a crossroads, and that's why the story is called Split Decision. And George said it wasn't that he wasn't enjoying rugby anymore. It's just that it was being made too hard where he was. And I get it, you know. Sports and programs will say, well, you know, we've got a program to run. We can't be making all these exceptions. But here's a point I'd like to make. And I think this is relevant to young athletes and their parents to keep in mind. You get selected for a program because you stand out. In other words, you're different, you're unique. There's something different about you and what you can do compared to other athletes. And then you get taken into a program, and all of a sudden, there starts to become a uniform set of standards and expectations that you adhere to. And for me, there's always a bit of an irony there, because young athletes can lose track of what their strength is, what their superpowers are, you know, because there aren't many complete athletes out there. We've all got something we're really good at and something we're not. And in that developmental process, we're encouraged to be able to get better at everything. But I've got a real strong message, which is be really clear about what makes you an individual. To the athlete, trust yourself, back your own judgment, and find a pathway that supports you to be able to develop in that way, because you've got to be able to keep standing out to be able to progress. So yeah, just to answer your question on the examples of guidance that can be given and how it worked out in that one scenario, there's an example of where George chose to go down the discus route, and it might have gone very easily a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible story. There's always bits that I guess any of us that have been involved in sport, educationalists, people who've worked with young people, it's always very difficult, because you think back when, as you say, when you're running programs and you want it to go well and you want your best players, and you try to do, run the program so everybody's in the same boat. But the reality is everybody's different with different contexts. And this often crops up around athletes and education, doesn't it? And balancing it.
Yeah.
Some parents have that choice. Oh, well, do we just give up the sport completely? Well, maybe for an odd child, that might be a good idea at that point in time. For a lot of kids, it's also their pressure release, their friendship group, and actually they would be far better continuing with the sport and doing the work alongside it. The thing that does stick out a lot sometimes is, why are people not having better conversations? And I say this in the organizations that I work with. Why is the communication between the coach, the program, the parent, and the awareness of the bigger picture of the individual that we're working with not brought more into the forefront? And I agree with you around that individuality, that, we go into programs and you see them expecting to adhere to the same, same traits, I guess, or the same things. Now, some of those you can do. Some of those are going to be pretty impossible for young people, certainly to start with, to fit in. And I definitely think there's got to be and I think it's coming a bit more. I think there's got to be a little bit more give and take, and the working on the relationship, that we're working with the person in front of us and everybody's individual.
Yeah, I think some sports are ahead on others, and ironically, often we say necessity is the mother of creation. And so when there are constraints in an environment, and one that I see in Australia doing a fantastic job at this is women's rugby sevens. Of course, women's rugby sevens in Australia do really well. World champions, gold medals at the Olympics. But what we've seen in Australia, and of course other places around the world, is the growth of opportunities for women and female athletes. And so with women's rugby sevens as a sport, because there isn't a national league in Australia, and to get into the national team and to be on the traveling the world on the World Series, then there's some serious time and effort put into your development, and you're just not going to be going straight into a team as an 18-year-old as a rule. And we've got the landscape in Australia now where you've got women's football. We just had the World Cup, which has been a massive fill-up for the country, so much interest. So you've got professional programs now at the clubs for the girls. At the same time, you've got the Australian Football League, the Aussie Rules. We've got the women's competition there. And we've also got the Women's National Rugby League. And it's really interesting, because what you can have is you can have a rugby league team that can say to a 16, 17, 18-year-old, you're doing really well, and we'd like you to come and play for our club. You can be playing each week at the stadium. There can be thousands of fans there. Your family can come, compared to an Olympic sport like rugby sevens, where there's not going to be the same kind of exposure. There isn't going to be such interest from agents and activity, and perhaps there's incentives being dangled a little bit earlier. And so in that example, and I use this because it's a really positive one, rugby sevens I've seen it firsthand of the way that they work with their athletes to make them feel really connected as a group, to have a really great experience when they come together, when they go away. They've just been to Youth Commonwealth Games and won the gold medal there, and to really build that competence. So this is basic psychological needs, those three things, to give people the feeling that they've got ability, to connect them as a group, so they really feel as though they're working at this together, and there's that real team bond, and also the autonomy to allow them to have some choices, so that if you have got another sport and you still want to, you're still keeping it going, then we're going to go with that for much longer. Because the opposite example, we know that if we force you to try and make a decision, well, very easily that could go the wrong way for us. So what we're doing is we're working with you. We're obviously giving you an insight into how well you're doing and where it could take you to. But we're just being far more receptive to that conversation about how's it going for you? What's the best way to do this?
Yeah, and which I suppose leads us nicely on to the next, question, because you've obviously spoken about George's story there, and obviously there are other stories throughout the book. From all of those stories, what would be the big highlights for you in terms of advice for coaches? You've obviously coached in your time as well, and I know I reflect a lot on my last 25 years or whatever that looks like. What would your advice, based on what you found today, because ultimately it's very recent, it's not 20 years ago. What advice are you giving to coaches on what you found?
Well, in a sentence, I would say treat talent development as a shared relationship. And it's a shared relationship between the coach, the athlete, and the parents from the beginning all the way through. You know, we know the worst type of example is when the coach and the parents are talking because there's a problem. Yeah. Whereas if we can be proactive from the beginning, I don't know where your organization is instrumental in this. How can we be proactive in the beginning to set up those practices and processes to allow us to have authentic communication, to treat the young person as part of that. And you're dead right. Recently, I was talking to a Premier League club, and they were saying how they encourage, whether it's the boys or the girls, to take holidays. Whereas in the past, it might have been, we can't go on holiday then because we've got this going on with the talent development program. And, you know, if we miss something, is that going to look bad on us? So, yeah, that shared relationship. And in terms of those authentic conversations, again, from my study and from my experience, there's one thing, regardless of how far you go in a talent development program, there's one thing that a talent development program teaches all athletes to get better at. And that is impression management. They learn to understand what it is the coach values, what the coach believes, the standards that the coach is looking for, and how to react and behave in that manner. Now, what I would say is some of the time the messages that the athlete is picking up from the coach aren't the message that the coach is intending to send. So that can be part of a problem. I mean, one of the stories in my book is about a gymnast and she says there, when I was young, my coach thought that I was going to be really good, but I can tell that he doesn't anymore. And that was never something that was specifically said to her. It was just from the behavior of that coach. Now, it might be wrong. It might be the coach has got a different role. It might be the coach has got other things going on and actually does things in a different way. And so perhaps doesn't give as much time as they used to. But yeah, that would be the key for coaches specifically. Because what we've got to try and encourage, because you said it there, why don't we have these genuine, authentic conversations? It's because there's a fear factor. There's a fear of, well, if I do the wrong thing, or if I say the wrong thing, or if I'm not at the first, or if I'm not looking like, again, there's another Rowan in the book. He said, he had a cousin who was older in the program. He'd done well. And he said, my cousin tells me that the coach looks for a good trainer. So I always make sure I'm at the front, you know? And in this example of Rowan, he'd even taken it further. He knew what coaches were looking for. So when he played, he would be against his opposition, and he would play the game in a way that would put his opposition in a spot that he knew was a weakness of theirs, so that they wouldn't look so good compared to him. Most coaches are probably going to see that, but I think that's the key. The concept it comes under is self-presentation. In other words, how you impression manage the adults who are running the program, because they're the ones who are going to make decisions. You know, the young people learn that straight away. And so they may be sending out the messages. I can talk to George on the rugby as well when he went on one of the development squad weekends. He said the coaches say that they're about development, but he said, but they want to win the games. And he said, and that's why I didn't get picked to start over another guy, because we're both props and he's heavier than me. And again, in George's story, he was talking about how they were encouraged to do the reflections in the diaries. And I said, okay, so did you put that down, how you felt that actually technically you're a better player? And he said, oh no, you don't put things like that down.
Yeah. And hey, look, we've all been there, haven't we? I mean, I speak to parents who worry about speaking up about something that actually is a genuine concern and would be really valid, and they're worried about their child being black marked and talked about, and the negative ramifications for that, which we're obviously trying to avoid. I think those authentic dialogues for me, and I'm caught up in the middle of all of them, between organizations and coach and parent and child back to the coach, child back to the parent. I can understand why there is maybe some fear there. Certainly when I speak to coaches, they're worried that if they let parents in too much, that they'll always be bothering them and taking charge, and they give the children too much voice. It's like, well, that means I've got absolutely no power anymore. And I know there is a fear amongst coaches that they feel like they're sort of sometimes just really isolated and alone now. And actually, we need to have some really strong leadership on people that understand how we connect the pathway, the organization, the coach, the parent, and the kid together. And to do that, you've got to understand kids, you've got to understand coaching, you've got to have some understanding of being a parent, you've got to have some understanding of, running sports programs, because there's got to be plenty of give or take, but it's not all give or take from one of those four parties. I always say everybody has a role to play, and I include the kids in that. The kids are an integral part of this, and we want them involved. And making sense of that, you can see the fear, but work we've done in some environments, it certainly can be done, and it's not as scary as it actually looks. It just needs somebody to make it all right, almost, as you're going through.
Yeah, and for the coach, I totally understand that, and of course, it's relative to the age and stage of the athlete, and with regards to how much autonomy or choice you're going to give them. In actual fact, the research that's been done looking at this has shown that if you give choice too soon to young athletes, then that's actually stressful for them, because they'd much rather have guidance at particular stages. So the way to bridge that gap is to actually give young athletes a choice between choices. So in other words, you've got two good options. Which good option would you like to take? So there's less danger there. But the other thing that I think about with coaches is, often when a coach is doing their best to help develop a young person, they want to see what's going on in the head of a young person. They're usually asking questions that they know the answers to. So the coach will ask a young person, and they're actually trying to see if the young person can get it right to give them the answer back. And what I always encourage coaches to do is ask a young athlete a question you don't know the answer to. And can you actually listen to a young person with a view to having your mind changed? Because you're dead right, obviously, as an adult, whether you're the coach or the parent, you've got a different set of experience, and you've got a duty of care. You've got a responsibility to guide and support, also to challenge and to push. And you're in that position because, especially if you're in a professional sports environment, you've got the credentials and you've got the experience to do that. But in terms of encouraging and doing the best for the young person, well, the best you can do for a young person is teach them how to be the best learner. Because however long they're with you for, whether they've learned things or not, when they leave you, they're still going to need to learn to do things, whether it's to learn to get better or whether it's to learn to play in a different way. That's the crux. So that's a key for coaches. You're teaching things, you're helping young people to get better at the way they train, the way they perform, but how well are you doing it, enable them to understand how they learn? And in terms of making mistakes is a key one, you see, because what we know is deep, sustained learning is messy. You cannot make mistakes. You cannot make good learning unless you make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so in terms of that, wanting to look good, showing the coach how it should be done, well, that's where we're on the wrong side of that communication with an athlete. If they think, I need to make sure that I don't make a mistake all the time.
Yeah.
And that guidance for a young athlete, that's all part of the process. We use the term non-linear development. You're going to get better. You're going to take a step back. So that's key for me with regards to the coaches and how it all fits in.
And I think that learning one's fascinating because, I think of the work you do with parents, guidance for parents, because when parents see the kids making a lot of mistakes, it's the world's worst thing that we've ever seen ever. And actually, it's our ability to accept, no, that's how they're learning. They're the moments that they're going to get better. How are you going to handle those conversations now? Not these mad panics that, oh my God, this is the worst thing in the world. You know, that's a difficult thing for them to understand and work with. Tell you what's interesting recently, when I've shown young people what their journey should look like and the reality of that non-linear journey, the ups and downs, the number of teenagers that have sat in workshops with me and have just looked at me and gone, oh, thank God somebody's told me it's all right for me to mess it up. Thank God somebody's told me it's all right for me to get it wrong. Thank you. And it's almost been the biggest takeaway from them. So I don't know whether these elements of perfectionism, whether that's through the world of media these days and social media, whether that's coming from unrealistic expectations from the people around them. But definitely that understanding of sports journeys, how we learn the things that are going to go on, we've got to bring to life for everybody. Which brings me on to the next bit. I mean, we talked about coaches, their advice to coaches. I guess let's do final questions today, conscious of time. So what's your, as most of our audience are generally parents, what do you think your best bit of advice is to sports parents based on what you found in your stories?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I did. I looked in the mirror and I decided, you know what? The best way to help my children is to model the process. So to actually share with them what I'm trying to achieve, what I'm really working hard at, what's not going so well for me, what I'm finding difficult, mistakes that I've made. So rather than telling them how it should be done, actually becoming an example of trying to do it myself. And that's, that's different. I think we do see coaches do this more now in high profile examples. I think the more that they can do that at the right time, in the right environment with the right athlete, it's modeling the behavior themselves. So as a parent, if you're trying to send a message that you need to work really hard if you want to achieve things, then are you walking the walk? And what I would say about that is, of course, not every parent wants to be a CEO or to be a top executive. And so a lot of parents or a lot of people in their work are really happy with the level of challenge they're at and the work that they're doing. And it's really positive to acknowledge that. It's really positive to actually celebrate success at whatever particular stage it is. And so, again, if we're encouraging young athletes to be holistic and work hard in different parts of their life, then it's not just about whether it's the parent at work or whether it's parents who's doing a bit of study. It's how balanced is the parent's life. What are most parents doing during the time that they're at their training session with their athletes 4 or 5 times a week? Are they sitting down and having a chat? Or are they actually looking after their own well-being themselves? Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes having a chat is good for your well-being, but like with me, if I make an excuse that, well, I haven't got time to keep myself physically active because I'm running my kids here, there, and everywhere, and then actually when training's going on, I just sit down for an hour each time. Then I'm not really talking the talk. Well, I am talking the talk, but I'm not walking the walk, I should say. So that would be the big one for parents. If you really want your children, boys and girls, to do as well as possible, and to find happiness in the right place that works for them, model it yourselves to them.
Yeah, without a doubt, we are the ultimate role models, and we've got a major part to play. Graham, what an absolute pleasure to have you on the Parents in Sport podcast. Thank you for sharing the amazing work you've done, the stories that you've told. It makes it really authentic. It's brought it to life for lots of people, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to do this again in the future.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Gordon. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. Check us out at parentsinsport.co.uk.